Get out of my bar right now and don't ever come back.
John Wayne was not a man anyone threw out of anywhere. Not on a movie set, not in a courtroom drama, and certainly not in a small-town bar where everyone knew his name. But on a cold November night, that is exactly what happened. The doors of Riley's Tavern swung open, and the biggest star in the country was told, in front of a stunned crowd, to leave and never come back. No one in that bar knew what would happen next. No one knew that a single bartender's quiet act of decency would change the course of 2 lives forever. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this from tonight? And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time, because stories like this one do not come around often. The year was 1968, and the town of Eldridge Falls sat quietly in the hills, far from the noise of Hollywood. Riley's Tavern had stood on the corner of Main Street for almost 3 decades, its wooden floors worn smooth by generations of boots, its walls lined with old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. It was the kind of place where strangers became regulars within a week, and regulars became family within a year. John Wayne had discovered Riley's almost by accident, during a break from filming a Western just outside of town. He liked the quiet of it, the way nobody fussed over him once he had ordered his first drink. He came back every evening for nearly a month, sitting at the same corner stool, talking to the same handful of locals about cattle, weather, and old war stories. To the people of Eldridge Falls, he was not a movie star. He was simply John. Behind the bar stood a young man named Daniel Pierce. Daniel was 26 years old, recently married, and barely keeping his head above water. His wife was expecting their first child, the rent on their small apartment was overdue, and the tips at Riley's were thin most nights. Still, Daniel showed up every shift with a clean apron and a steady smile, pouring drinks with the kind of patience that came from a man who had nothing left to lose and everything still to prove. Daniel had grown up watching John Wayne's films in the town's only theater, the kind of films that made a boy believe in courage, loyalty, and second chances. Serving him drinks every night felt, in some small way, like living inside one of those stories. Daniel never asked for autographs. He never made a fuss. He simply listened, refilled the glass when it was empty, and treated John the way he treated every other tired man who walked through that door. The trouble started with a man named Walter Briggs, the tavern's owner, a bitter and proud man who had never once watched a single one of John Wayne's films. Walter had taken over the bar after his father's passing, and he ran it the way he believed a business should be run, with rules, with control, and with very little patience for anyone who challenged him in front of a crowd. That particular night, the tavern was fuller than usual. Word had spread that the movie star was filming nearby, and a few out-of-town visitors had wandered in, hoping for a glimpse of him. One of them, a brash young man who had clearly had too much to drink, began needling John about his films, mocking his characters, and laughing too loudly at his own jokes. John, ever even-tempered, brushed it off with a tired smile, and asked the man to lower his voice. Walter, watching from behind the register, saw only one thing: a disturbance in his bar and a famous face at the center of it. Rather than asking the drunk visitor to leave, Walter marched straight to John's table, and in front of everyone told him that his presence was causing trouble, and that he would no longer be welcome at Riley's Tavern. The room fell silent. John did not argue. He simply nodded, set down a few bills on the table, and stood up to leave. But as he turned toward the door, he caught Daniel's eye behind the bar. Daniel was frozen, a half-poured glass in his hand, his face flushed with embarrassment on his employer's behalf. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "This isn't right, and you know it isn't." Walter shot him a sharp look, a silent warning that Daniel understood all too well. Speaking up against the owner, especially in front of customers, was not something a bartender with a pregnant wife and an overdue rent payment could afford to do twice. John paused at the door. He looked back at Daniel, not at Walter, and gave him a small, grateful nod. Then he stepped out into the cold November night, and the door swung shut behind him. The bar buzzed with whispers for the rest of the evening. Some customers muttered that Walter had gone too far. Others said nothing at all, too afraid of losing their welcome the way John had lost his. Daniel finished his shift in near silence, the weight of what he had witnessed sitting heavy in his chest. He kept replaying the moment John looked back at him, and he could not shake the feeling that something larger than a bar fight had just taken place. What no one else in the tavern knew that night was that Daniel's small act of defense did not end at the door. 2 days later, on his afternoon off, Daniel walked nearly a mile out of town to the modest cabin where the film crew had set up lodging for its cast. He had asked around quietly, careful not to draw attention, until he found out exactly where John was staying. He almost turned back twice. It felt foolish, even reckless, for a bartender to show up uninvited at a movie star's door. But he kept walking, because something inside him insisted that decency should not end the moment the cameras stopped rolling. When John opened the door, he looked more surprised than annoyed. Daniel introduced himself properly for the first time, explained who he was, and admitted that he simply wanted to apologize on behalf of the town and on behalf of Walter for how he had been treated. John invited him inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and the 2 men talked for nearly an hour. Daniel spoke about his wife, his coming child, and his hopes of one day opening a small repair shop of his own. John spoke about the loneliness of fame, the way people often saw the character on the screen before they saw the man standing in front of them. By the end of that conversation, something had shifted between them. It was not the relationship of a star and a fan. It was the beginning of a quiet friendship between 2 men who had simply chosen to treat each other with respect. There was a cost to what Daniel had done, though he did not realize it yet. Word eventually reached Walter that his bartender had gone looking for John Wayne after the incident. Walter saw it as disloyalty, a betrayal of the bar's reputation, and from that day forward he watched Daniel a little more closely, trusted him a little less, and made his life at Riley's just a little harder than it needed to be. Daniel never regretted it. He told his wife that night, as they sat at their small kitchen table counting coins for the rent, that some things mattered more than a job. She squeezed his hand and told him she was proud of him, even as she quietly worried about how they would make ends meet. Neither of them could have known that this single act of kindness, offered with no expectation of anything in return, would one day return to them tenfold. The film crew packed up and left Eldridge Falls within the month, and John Wayne's life moved on to other towns, other films, other stories far removed from a small-town tavern. Daniel kept working at Riley's, though Walter's resentment never fully faded. The years passed quietly and without mercy. Daniel's daughter was born the following spring, a small, healthy girl with her mother's eyes. For a while, joy outweighed hardship. But as the years went on, the weight of barely getting by began to wear on him. Walter cut his hours whenever business slowed. The repair shop Daniel had once dreamed of opening remained nothing more than a drawing folded inside an old notebook, tucked away in a drawer he rarely opened anymore. By the time Daniel turned 34, Riley's tavern itself was struggling. Walter had grown older, more tired, and less interested in running the place. Customers had thinned out as a newer bar opened across town, one with brighter lights and cheaper drinks. Daniel found himself doing the work of 3 men for the pay of 1, simply to keep the doors open and his family fed. There were nights he sat alone after closing, wiping down the same bar he had wiped down 1,000 times before, wondering if his life would always look exactly like this. He thought, every so often, of that conversation in the small cabin years ago, of the quiet dignity in John Wayne's voice as he spoke about choosing decency even when no one was watching. Daniel held on to that memory the way some men hold on to a worn photograph, not because it changed his circumstances, but because it reminded him that integrity, even unrewarded, was still worth choosing. He never expected anything to come of that long-ago afternoon. He had not done it for a reward, but life, as it often does, was quietly preparing a moment he could never have predicted. It was a gray October afternoon, almost 15 years to the week since that cold November night, when a long black car pulled up outside Riley's tavern. Daniel was behind the bar, restocking glasses, when the door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, silver now threading through his hair, but his presence filling the room exactly as it had all those years before. For a moment, Daniel simply stared, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. Then the man smiled, the same easy, unhurried smile Daniel remembered from a small cabin, and a cup of coffee shared between two strangers who had decided to be honest with each other. "You still pour a drink the same way," John Wayne said, settling onto the same corner stool he had occupied 15 years earlier. Daniel could barely find his voice. "I didn't think you'd remember this place, or me." "I remember exactly who stood up for a stranger when it cost him something," John said quietly. "That's not the kind of thing a man forgets." Walter had passed away 2 winters before, and the tavern now belonged, on paper, to a bank that had been threatening foreclosure for months. Daniel had been keeping the doors open on borrowed time and borrowed money, unwilling to let the old place die without a fight, even as everyone around him quietly assumed it would. John listened as Daniel explained all of this, his voice steady, but his hands betraying the exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long. John asked careful questions about the debts, about the building, about what Daniel would do with the tavern if the weight of money were lifted from his shoulders entirely. Daniel laughed softly, almost bitterly, and admitted that he used to dream of fixing the place up properly, of finally opening that small repair shop in the back room he had never used, of giving his daughter a life that did not depend on the mood of a landlord or the patience of a bank. John said nothing more that afternoon. He finished his drink, shook Daniel's hand, and told him he would be back the following week. Daniel did not know what to make of it. He told his wife that night that he suspected nothing more than an old man revisiting old memories. He had no idea that John had already begun making calls before his car had even left the edge of town. A week later, John returned, this time with a lawyer and a folder of papers that Daniel did not understand at first glance. John explained, in plain and unhurried words, that he had quietly paid off the outstanding debt on the tavern in full. The building, the land beneath it, and everything inside it now belonged free and clear to Daniel Pierce. Daniel sat down slowly on one of the old wooden stools, his hands trembling as he turned the papers over, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. The signature at the bottom of the deed was unmistakably real. "I don't understand," Daniel finally managed to say. "Why would you do this for me? It's just a bar. I'm just the man who poured your drinks." John shook his head slowly. "You were the only person in this town who treated me like a man instead of a poster on a wall. You walked a mile out of your way to apologize for someone else's cruelty, and you never once asked for anything in return. I've spent half my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. You never did." Daniel's wife, who had come to the bar after receiving an urgent phone call from her husband, stood in the doorway with their now teenage daughter, both of them frozen at the sight of the papers spread across the bar top.
Tears slipped down Daniel's face before he could stop them. 15 years of quiet struggle, finally giving way in front of the one man who remembered the smallest, simplest act of decency Daniel had ever offered. John placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Fix up that back room," he said. "Open your repair shop. Keep pouring drinks if you want to, but do it because it's yours now, not because you're afraid of losing it. Word of what happened spread through Eldridge Falls within days, though Daniel never spoke of it as a grand gesture. To him, it was simply proof of something he had always believed but had never been able to prove. That kindness offered without expectation has a way of returning when it is needed most, sometimes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes many years later than anyone could have imagined. John Wayne never sought credit for what he did that October afternoon, and Daniel Pierce never let the story turn him into someone he was not. He simply kept pouring drinks behind the same worn bar, now with his name on the deed and his daughter occasionally helping out after school. The repair shop opened the following spring, exactly where Daniel had once only dared to imagine it. What stayed with everyone who heard the story was not the wealth or the gesture itself, but the simple truth behind it. One quiet act of standing up for what is right, offered with nothing expected in return, can echo for years before it finally finds its way back to you. If this story moved you tonight, let us know in the comments which part stayed with you the longest. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story like this one. We will see you in the next video.